This is a continuation of our series, What is Popular Culture? This is part 4, Communication Theory. We've thought about Marxism as an early analytical framework for the study of popular culture. Marxism provided a way to think through what appeared in the early 20th century to be a clear division in the quality of cultural products. So to Marxist analysis, like those from the Frankfurt School, the division between bourgeoisie and proletariat suggested an explanation for the difference between what they defined as quote-unquote high culture and low culture. Horkheimer defined high culture as didactic, that is, educational culture, right? He thought that it was valued and valuable because it was something or taught something about the human condition. And he believed that low culture, which he thought of as simple, with no educational value and nothing encouraging high moral values, created an environment in which the lower classes did not learn the value of literacy and especially did not learn the ideas of philosophers or the power of mathematics or the morality of religion. It encouraged them to remain ignorant. This, according to Horkheimer, allowed the bourgeoisie to control the proletariat. Now, I want to make it clear that although the Marxist school is addressing this difference between high culture and low culture, in actuality, nearly everyone at the time did think about culture in these terms, right? You didn't have to be a Marxist to imagine high culture and low culture, right? Opera, for example, the art of Picasso, or particularly the art of the Renaissance masters, was considered didactic, educational, high art for people who had the money to get the education to really understand it, whereas low culture was considered to be popular songs, popular movies, plays that had mostly body content or humor, and this was not a Marxist division, right? But Horkheimer and Adorno, as Marxists, were trying to explain it using Marxism as a framework. And the reason they used that was not only because that was their particular philosophical bent, but also because Marxism did suggest this difference between classes, right? So it seemed to fit. And this low culture, according to them, allowed or encouraged the proletariat or common people to remain ignorant. And according to Horkheimer, it allowed the bourgeoisie to control the proletariat. At the same time, high culture taught the bourgeoisie that they were better, more powerful, and deserving of that power. They used capitalism to protect their position. Horkheimer therefore thought of popular culture, culture for the masses, right, as low culture, and hoped to get rid of it. He wanted to eradicate it. Despite the fact that he was a Marxist, for him, low culture was anathema because its simplicity discouraged education and thoughtfulness and therefore kept them in their place. So for Horkheimer, low culture was anathema, right? And he thought that if a high culture could be produced for the masses, it would teach them values that they needed to understand how they were being used by the capitalist system. There have been many critiques of Horkheimer, and we're certainly not done with this. This is not the final theory, right? But among the most powerful critiques of Horkheimer is the argument that he fundamentally misunderstood popular culture because he only analyzed it from one side. He gave too much credit to producers and not enough to the audience by assuming that producers, A, know what they are producing and how it will be received, and B, that the audience is only passive receivers. Horkheimer missed some simple realities. In fact, one of the key tenets of the capitalism that Horkheimer was so critical of can explain the relationship between pop culture producer and pop culture audience. That is, to put it in idiomatic terms, it takes two to tango, right? In more formal capitalist terms, we have to understand popular culture as a product for sale in the market. In such a context, products like pop culture are bought and sold. It takes two parties to make the exchange. A seller needs a buyer and so forth. We can look at this from another point of view. Think of the popular culture as communication. Communication takes at least two parties. In the traditional communication model, a sender and a receiver, like you see here in this slide, in the image below, right, these are created, this is an image of the model created by Shannon and Weaver. Communication happens between two individuals. One is a sender, the other is a receiver. The message can go directly from one to the other, as in conversation, or it can go through other channels, right, represented by the two antennae. We could be talking about TV broadcaster to television receiver. We could be talking about server to computer, or peer-to-peer, right? So, computer to computer over multiple different nodes, right? But the point is that the message can go directly from one to the other or indirectly through a channel between these two. And so all channels are subject to interference, right? And that interference can disrupt the clarity of the message in part or as a whole. Now, interference can be simple, right? If we're thinking about broadcast and we have a thunderstorm, that electrical discharge in the air can disrupt a radio signal or a broadcast TV signal. If we have cable TV, we can recognize that a cable can be crimped, it can be bent, it can be partially or fully severed, and that is all interference, right? If we think about Wi-Fi communication, we have similar issues. If we think about internet communication, server issues, server downtime, all kinds of different problems with decoding packets, with IP addresses, etc. These things are all interference, and they fit within this theory of communication, right? So all channels are subject to some kind of interference, which can disrupt the clarity of the message in part or in whole. And that means we can never be sure in a communicational situation that we've gotten the entire message. Shannon and Weaver's model is useful, but it still doesn't explain much about popular culture, except to help us remember that popular culture products are both produced and received. And this must mean that both producer and receiver have some role to play in determining its meaning. So theorist Stuart Hall, who's considered the founder of the Birmingham School, okay, so add this one to your list, the Frankfurt School with Horkheimer and Adorno, and now we have Stuart Hall and later some others in the Birmingham School, a later school added to this theory of communication. Hall proposed a model that involved active audience theory. Okay, that's his idea, in which the receiver is not passive, right, but is an active partner in the process of communication. So Hall saw even two-way communication between individuals as fraught with difficulty, and it's not just the interference in the channel that causes that difficulty. Hall theorized that a speaker encodes an intended message, what Hall called a text, even though it may not be written in a book or written on a page, a text is the message, right, into language. Once that encoding is done, it is then delivered directly to the receiver, who actively decodes and understands it according to his or her own experiences. So we have the experiences of the speaker in encoding the message using the language and life experience and understanding of communication that she or he has, and then the decoding goes through a process that includes the experiences of the receiver. And those experiences can include social class, situational context, desires and position with respect to the sender. Hall claimed that the process was much more complex even than that, and this complexity began with the encoding of the message. So one way to think about this, just briefly as an example, is confront a local Hawaii person who uses pidgin to communicate with their receiver, and the receiver being maybe a tourist, okay, who may never have heard pidgin before, especially Hawaiian pidgin, right? That difference in encoding experience and decoding experience can make a huge difference in the way the message is understood. So this is Stuart Hall's encoding decoding communication theory. Encoding into language, even one that both communicators understand clearly, involves filtering the message and the language through the sender's own personal experiences. When that's done, the delivery of the text, or the message, right, must occur via a channel. Speaking, writing, broadcasting, etc. These are all channels. That channel can be composed in various ways by what Hall called compromised, right? In various ways by what Hall called noise. This includes outside influences, organized or not, that disrupt the message on its journey between sender and receiver. Further, when the receiver does not get does get the message, it's decoded through the filter of the receiver's own personal experiences, which are different from those of the sender. It's kind of miraculous that communication even happens at all. But when it does, the result is rarely complete understanding. Hall offers three basic standpoints from which the receiver can interpret the message. And remember, the receiver is actively decoding or interpreting the message, but these basic standpoints are not necessarily conscious points of view. They're just three different standpoints that may occur in the process of decoding, right? Those three standpoints include understanding and accepting the message as it's intended, which Hall calls the preferred reading. Now, the reader may not know that that's as it's intended, but may be able to assume that that's as it's intended. And that would be a sort of lucky shot, right, where we get exactly what the sender meant, and we accept what the sender meant without really worrying about whether we agree with it or not. Taking the message to mean exactly the opposite is another possible standpoint, right? And we often do this, right? When people use an intonation that we're unfamiliar with, we may assume that they're being ironic when they're actually being serious. We may assume that they're being angry when they're actually not being angry at all, right? So if we accidentally or intentionally take the message to mean exactly the opposite of what was intended, then Stuart Hall labeled this the contested or the oppositional reading, okay? Now, more common probably than both is intentionally or unintentionally accepting some parts of the message while rejecting others. And Hall called this the neutral or negotiated reading, right? And by reading he means decoding of the message, whether it's audio, video, textual, whatever, okay? So this requires that to interpret cultural products, any analyst has to try and uncover all the possible readings of the product, okay? If I say to you, don't do that, you need to not just make assumptions about the tone of my voice and what I mean by don't do that. You need to decode all of the possible meanings in order to get as close as possible to what I could have meant. So if you assume that it's possible that when I say don't do that, I actually mean the opposite, do that, right? And of course we do this all the time. We communicate using the opposite words. When I was teaching language in Japan, it was often very difficult for me to explain to my students why Americans call a diamond a rock, right? Because a rock is not pretty and a diamond is beautiful and expensive. This is a very difficult thing. So you have to get all possibilities. If I say don't do that, maybe I actually mean do that. Maybe I mean exactly what I've said. Don't do that. Or maybe I mean don't do it that way. Or do it in a different way, right? These are the three different readings. Don't do that as meaning don't do that. Well, that would be obviously Stuart Hall's version of the preferred reading, okay? If I say don't do that and I actually mean do it, well, that's the oppositional reading. And of course, if I say don't do that and I actually mean don't do it that way, that's a negotiated or a neutral reading. Okay, and these happen, as I said, not necessarily intentionally. They happen in the process of decoding unintentionally as the receiver filters the message or the text through their own experiences. So here are here is a table indicating the interaction of the three methods of interpreting a text, right, based on Hall's theory. And Wikipedia provided this, I didn't, so just so that you know, all right. So we can put this in a matrix. Okay, and the dominant hegemonic position, or the dominant hegemonic encoding, this would be the reading that is intended. Okay, so this is a different version of the same terms I used before. So dominant hegemonic would be dominant hegemonic reading of the text. That would mean that both the sender and the receiver, the encoding position and the decoding position, get the message as the sender intended it and decode it as the sender intended it. But if the sender uses this dominant hegemonic position as this specific term, right, or a specific message, and encodes exactly what they mean, but the receiver uses a negotiated encoding, right, a partly critical text, then they receive it in a way that, again, intentionally or unintentionally, gets the dominant hegemonic reading of the text and neutralizes it. If they receive it as an oppositional encoding, this is a radical text, right? Then the dominant hegemonic reading is also neutralized. Okay, so if I say don't do that, and you hear don't do that, and you don't do that, then, right, you have done exactly what I intended. If I say don't do that, and you hear don't do it that way, then you've not heard exactly what I intended, and you do something very different, or you understand my message very differently. My message has been neutralized. And if, of course, I say don't do that, and you hear me say don't do that, but you believe I mean do that, then of course my intent has been neutralized, right? You can communicate from a negotiated position. You can communicate from an oppositional position as well, right? So I could say don't do that and mean don't do it that way, right? And if you hear it as don't do it, right, then, well, that's probably working, right? And so we get behavior or an understanding that I intended, at least in part. If you hear don't do that in that way, when I say don't do that in that way, right, then again, you've gotten exactly what I wanted, the negotiated reading. But the oppositional text also operates in this way, right? So there's no neutralization here. In the oppositional way, if I say don't do that, what I mean is actually do it. Don't do that, right? And what I mean is, yeah, do that. And you hear me say, don't do that, and you understand me to mean do it, then you've got it. If I say the same thing and you understand me to mean don't do that in that way, then you're kind of amplifying your critique of what I've said, right? In other words, like here, except that it's not neutralized, it's amplified. You're doing something different, or your reaction is somewhat different than what I expect. And if the oppositional position and the encoding radical, or the decoding position, right, if they happen in the same way, then we both get an agreement. Okay, and so we can do this with products, which is what we really want to do in this class, right? So let's do the clothespin experiment. If we take popular culture to be communication and understand that what Hall meant by a text is not just a written document, but any communication from which we take meaning, then we can see that Hall has come up with a kind of theory that shows us both how complex popular culture can be to understand and a method by which we can begin to understand it through both producer and audience analysis. By analyzing both producer intent and audience reception, we can come up with many of the possible meanings of popular culture. And usually we can find the negotiated meanings in those popular culture products. So let's think of it just by imagining a clothespin. Over here on the left, you can see it. What is a clothespin used for? Well, I mean, the dominant hegemonic position, right? The intended use of a clothespin is to clip clothes onto a clothes drying hanger line. But for various reasons, including the fact that most of us don't have clothes hanging lines or clothes drying lines in our yards these days, right? But clothespins are still manufactured. We usually use them for something completely different than what they're intended. And we do that for our own reasons. We can see that, right, in these pictures. So a clothespin is not just a clothespin. The buyers of the clothespin may not even have laundry to hang, right? They often buy clothespins for purposes not at all related to the purpose of the maker. So much so that we can say now that so few people in the United States hang their laundry, right? That other unplanned uses might even surpass the purpose that was the original intent of the invention of this product. So in other words, the buyers, will call them consumers or the audience. For the rest of the course, we'll call them the audience or consumers because they are consuming products. They choose their own uses for the clothespins. And just because I like cute things, I chose this. This is a particularly cute use of clothespins, right? Turning them into little mermaids, putting them on a little net with tiny little starfish, and decorating a room or a house with them, right? Clothespins are not intended to be decorations, and yet they end up as decorations. They end up as race cars. Good heavens, maybe we'll have a flip grid and have you guys come up with various possible unintended uses of clothespins. This is what Stuart Hall means by a negotiated or an oppositional meaning. So here's an oppositional reading. Okay, we do the same, of course, for popular culture products. Those uses are not always obviously different from what they're intended. It's harder to change the content of a video than to change the purpose of a clothespin. But that content can be changed, especially in the decoding phase, right? The reception. More often, it's just sort of interpreted in ways that the original producer didn't intend and probably could not have anticipated. And here's a great example of that in American popular music, right? It's not uncommon in the United States for fireworks on Independence Day to be accompanied by Bruce Springsteen's "Born in the USA." And the words to this song, if you listen to them, can kind of make you think again about what that means. The song's words, if we look at them and at the music and even at the video, we can make some attempts to analyze the different positions that Hall says interpretations will take. And it includes the following positions, right? Both of encoding. Springsteen will not say what he meant by this song. So this is one of the other things that is now kind of canon in literary studies. It's also important in popular culture studies. The author doesn't control the meaning of a text once it's been released to the public. And Springsteen certainly doesn't control the meaning of "Born in the USA." That song is so popular and so common and used for so many purposes. And he realizes that. He's not stupid. So he won't say what he meant by the song. But I think the words are there to make an interesting counterpoint to the fireworks. Again, not trying to put any words in Bruce Springsteen's mouth. Far be it from me to argue with the boss, right? But so decoding, the audience members interpret the meaning of the song in a different way. So if you match the different positions with the meanings that represent them, the different positions we talked about with Stuart Hall, then you should find some interesting possible readings of the song. Remember that encoding has to do with what Springsteen might have meant, and there's no way we can know that because we are not Springsteen. Okay, even though we speak his language and we've listened to the song many times, anyone who says to you what Springsteen meant was, if they're not Springsteen, and Springsteen hasn't told them specifically what he meant, and even that is fraught, right? You have a hard time actually being authoritative about that. So everything is an interpretation, right? And decoding has to do with how the audience understands his meaning as filtered through their own experiences and desires, and even the context they're hearing it in. So if you look at this song, right, "Born down in a dead man's town, the first kick I took was when I hit the ground, end up like a dog that's been beat too much till you spend half your life just covering it up." And then he says, "Born in the USA." So this first verse along with the chorus doesn't seem to actually fit the celebratory fireworks of the 4th of July, right? He goes on to say, got in a little hometown jam, so they put a rifle in my hand, sent me off to a foreign land to go and kill the yellow man. Well, here's something that's very difficult and interesting, and we need to get into it, right? Because this has to do probably with the Vietnam War. Although it could certainly have to do with the Pacific War. Springsteen didn't experience that personally, and he was around, although I don't believe he was in Vietnam. But he's talking here about being forced into the military, and that doesn't work today because our military in the United States today is, right, it's an all volunteer force. So they don't put a rifle in your hand unless you volunteered. In this case, then, this is probably a reference to the draft. But again, I'm interpreting, and your interpretation of this is just as valid as mine. We just need to dig into all of the possible meanings. Did Springsteen mean this? That's kind of irrelevant. What's relevant is what the audience takes from it, right? And we can create these readings. So this is at the core then of what I've said earlier